Hello everyone, this is Shadow. Due to copyright restrictions on YouTube, I can't publish many of the audiobooks you love. That's why I've created a special paid service where you can enjoy over 300 high-quality audiobooks from platforms like Webnovel, Pocket FM, Audible, Wuxia, and more. Each novel comes as a one-time purchase, no subscriptions, no hidden fees. After payment, you'll receive full access via Telegram, along with all future updates for that novel. You'll find a wide selection of your favorite genres and titles, always in premium audio quality. Check the full list of available novels in the description. DM me now to get your favorite stories in audiobook form and start listening today. Chapter 7407 Inadequately Tested. Chapter 7407 Inadequately Tested. Inducting Alexa Strion into the Mech Designer system was a significant act. For the first time, the system gained a user who did not start out as a poor third-class mech designer or an average second-class mech designer. While VS had a high opinion of himself, Gloriana and Kedis, he had no illusions about their ability to succeed without relying on lots of external aid. He knew very well that the benefits provided by the system directly or indirectly boosted their careers far ahead of their age brackets. This support used to go through himself, but now the two women did not have to bother with that anymore as they could directly spend their AP on attractive goodies. Both of them benefited enormously from this change. Though VS did not pay close attention to how much AP they earned and what they spent it on, he could track their overall improvement quite clearly by observing their work results. Gloriana and Kedis accessed the system much later than VS. They had already formulated their design philosophies and built up decent foundations. Becoming users meant that they could strategically exchange enlightenment fruits that complemented and deepened their core specializations at an incredibly fast rate. VS expected Alexa to adopt a different spending strategy. Due to her stellar Terran background and education, her foundation was already fairly broad and extensive. What she needed the most was depth. She needed to develop a handful of specializations that could distinguish her work from that of others, including that of VS himself. Their technical performance could be described as decent, but outside of their inheritance stuff, they lacked the spark of brilliance that could turn them into memorable and highly valued products. This was not because Alexa was incompetent or lacking in imagination. She might not be as creative as himself, but she was a pretty good artist in her own right. What she truly lacked were strong secondary specializations that could accentuate her dynastic mech concept and allow them to flourish in their own right. The tree of possibilities gave her the option to develop these strengths at a much faster and more convenient rate than usual. VS and Gloriana deliberately refrained from advising or recommending her to absorb any specific enlightenment fruits. It would be too patronizing for the pair of seniors to micromanage the development of a journeyman. Though Alexa was younger than the miracle couple, she was already an adult who had reached the stage in her career where she could comfortably go independent and find her own way. VS had monitored her work and progress long enough to trust her judgment. He did not think she would spend her AP on any foolish or frivolous items. In any case, there was no point in hovering over her shoulders as she initially made use of the system. It would be better to wait a few months before checking up on her progress. That should be enough time for her to earn a tidy sum of AP and exchange them for a few affordable but impactful enlightenment fruits. In the meantime, VS intended to pay a little more attention to Xanther Larkinson and Sarah Voikin. Compared to Alexa, VS understood them a lot less, but that was mainly because he was too busy to interact with them too frequently. As VS became more involved in galactic affairs, he pushed aside most of the work related to managing the design department to Gloriana and Alexa. As the director and vice director of the department in question, they had assumed most of the burden of tracking the progress of all of the mech designers. While VS was willing to trust the two women to understand their subordinates well enough to judge whether any of the latter deserved to join their little club, this was not enough. The mech designer system was far too important and sensitive for VS to act negligent when it came to screening potential entrants. He resolved to cooperate a little more closely with Xanther and Sarah in their route design work. "We are almost ready to cast off, sir," Admiral Gori Tenson reported. VS turned his attention away from the system and returned to the present. Inviting Alexa into the mech designer system had been the last chore on his immediate to-do list. The Blue Jay fleet had already loaded in the last batch of supplies and personnel transfers. All of the starships and warships had been fully replenished and could take part in a lengthy campaign at any time. "Let's be on our way then," VS responded. "Is there anything I should know about the fleet?" The admiral of the Blue Jay fleet decided to issue a tentative warning. Due to the priority of this fleet, the RA and RF have brought over new and experimental technology. This should make our forces considerably more effective in combat, but not all of the new weapons and equipment have undergone proper testing cycles. While I am not casting doubt on the developers, complex experimental systems have a tendency to misbehave, especially when they are being stressed. VS threw a glance at the admiral. "What are you saying, exactly?" I believe the scientists and developers are good enough to produce new technologies that work fine under normal simulations and highly controlled testing environments. What I am not confident in is that their new products will be able to withstand the rigor of heavy use and continuous fighting. Battle damage, wear and tear, and unintentional mishandling all have the potential to cause a potential cascade of errors. I have seen it happen before during calmer times, and I expect that such events have a much higher likelihood of occurring during this dire period. As a mech designer, VS understood the Admiral's concerns. He knew quite well how new technologies could produce accidents because they had not undergone thorough testing. It was too tedious and time-consuming to stress test new technologies to their limit and beyond. Back in the age of mechs, the meshers and fleeters would definitely dedicate a dozen years or more solely on exhaustive tests on any new and innovative technologies. They could not afford to do so anymore now that they had entered the Age of Dawn. The alien invasions continued to maul the troops at the front lines with each passing day. Even if recent developments had caused people to become a little more optimistic, the native aliens and the mutated Vorabugs still had plenty of chances to cause huge setbacks. The two wars ignited red humanity's drive for progress. Human technology advanced by leaps and bounds, but all of this reckless progression produced a lot of unintended consequences. VS had read plenty of industry articles that described a sharp rise in accident rates. More products came out with faults that should have been detected and addressed during testing phases. Though the benefits obviously justified the added risks, that did not necessarily make the victims happy. Do we have enough time during our journey to the Terran front to stress test the new gear by ourselves? VS quietly asked. The Admiral shook his head. Not even close enough. We lack the time as well as the conditions to conduct proper trials for all of the new tech. We can only explore them cautiously and reduce their exposure to limit-breaking conditions. As long as we do not impose a heavy load on them, I am reasonably certain that their performance will remain within tolerable boundaries. In other words, the Blue Jay fleet must never be put in a desperate situation like the last battle. I cannot promise you that we can remain out of hot water forever, VS grimly stated. However, once we reunite with the premier fleet of my clan, your mechs and warships don't have to bear all of the burden yourselves. With multiple ace mechs and 30 ascended giants at our disposal, the enemy will treat your assets as background noise. I have mixed feelings about that, sir. On the one hand, I hope that your words are true, so that my assets will not be forced to perform beyond their operational limitations. On the other hand, we are all soldiers who have pledged an oath to defend red humanity and destroy any aliens that threaten our civilization. We cannot do so as effectively if we are being treated as marginal threats. VS smiled at that. That is why we should count the new technologies as a blessing rather than a burden. Your men may not be as remarkable as our champions, but tech and hardware can partially make up for all of the gaps. I have inspected the Nacer Flex received by the Moloch Squadron. Their quantities are not too high, but they have the potential to cut off thousands of phase fighters from their motherships and maybe even isolate individual enemy phase lords. We need that kind of ingenuity to empower our mundane soldiers. I agree in principle, the older naval commander said. However, I am not enthusiastic about my fleet being used as an improvised testing platform. Deploying so many new systems and technologies at a time is a recipe for disaster. I do not have to perform any calculations to predict that one of our new mechs or warships will eventually suffer glitches during a serious engagement. Those glitches may end up producing a series of faults that can cause a partial shutdown or inflict crippling damage to core systems. The risk of this happening should not be too great to mechs, but the same could not be said for warships. The latter were much bigger and more complex. Their hulls easily crammed in hundreds if not thousands of different systems and subsystems, each of which were intricately connected with each other. One minor fault could cause other faults in dozens of other systems. These errors could subsequently cause misalignments in even more systems. All of this made the deployment of new and untested starships a risky endeavor. Though VS personally did not think it would be that bad for the starships and warships of the Blue Jay fleet, he could not afford to ignore the prudent warning issued by a knowledgeable and experienced naval commander. The two began to discuss possibilities of slowing down the upcoming campaign so that the crews could spend more time on testing the new technologies. The personnel could also spend the additional delays on more inspections and repairs. While VS was willing to stretch the timeline a bit, there had to be a limit on how much they delayed the sequence of their upcoming maneuvers. The more we slow down, the more we put our forces at risk, he said. Our upcoming incursion into native alien space relies heavily on speed and shock to stay a few steps ahead of any enemy responses and counterattacks. We cannot afford to slow down too much or else the native aliens will be able to amass their fleets and launch an overwhelming attack at our coordinates. Then we will have to find a balance that satisfies both our internal and external safety. Admiral Tenson concluded. Much like anything else, they needed to strike an optimal balance. VS actually was not too concerned about the assets of the Blue Jay fleet. Even if an accident occurred, There should still be plenty of other friendly assets that could cover for the ones that malfunctioned. What he was truly concerned about was the readiness of his upcoming Woodsap mechs. The Terrans had truly invested a lot of manpower and resources into the Arboreal project, but it was such an innovative and unprecedented approach to mech design that the probability of faults still remained high. This was because no matter how much the Terrans invested in the Elemental Carmine mech design project, they could not completely eliminate the need for time. The prototype Woodsap mechs needed to undergo an extensive amount of testing before VS could even think of making them available to a wider audience. Thank you for reading my work. If you wish to support the Mech Touch, please vote with your golden tickets. Purchase privilege for the Mech Touch. Read a varying amount of chapters ahead of regular readers, while enjoying a 99% discount on unlocking new chapters. Chapter 7408, The Hibiscus System. Chapter 7408, The Hibiscus System. The Blue Jay fleet finally went underway. It left the Yernstal Central Star node without any issue and proceeded to journey to the Terran Alliance along a safe and busy trade route. Though trade between the first-rate colonial empires and the Red Ocean Union had dropped significantly since the latter declared independence, goods still flowed across their borders. Couldn't be helped. Trade was far too important to both sides. They all lacked certain resources while possessing others in abundance. Trade had to persist even if relations between the partners had soured. Of course, the volume of trade between colonial alliances had dropped by over 50%. Groups increasingly preferred to keep their goods in-house even if it incurred a greater burden on their balance sheets. In addition, the native aliens increasingly refined their commerce raiding activities. The border regions had become increasingly more permeable, enabling the enemy to dispatch small but annoyingly fast raiding flotillas that preyed on undefended or lightly defended transportation ships. This problem became especially more pronounced in the zones closest to the fighting. This made it exponentially more difficult and expensive to resupply the hungry defenders at the front lines. Regional trade became increasingly more unbalanced as a consequence. Trade in and around the cybernetic empire flourished due to being stationed furthest away from the active war zones. Shipping became a lot more congested in the rear of human space, so much so that premiums had risen by several 100% in just a single month. All of these massive shifts caused severe trade disruptions as well as unbalanced many enterprises. VS occasionally received reports that the Living Mech Corporation and its many manufacturing partners had been forced to shut down production lines due to supply shocks and profitability issues. Fortunately, almost every other company suffered from issues, so the LMC did not lose that much competitiveness compared to its peers. That said, VS noticed that the more agile and responsive members of the mech industry had already begun to adjust their business practices. Many companies proved unable to pivot their business and development strategies to account for all of the changes. However, many one-man shops and companies led by very active mech designers had already begun to publish mech designs that imposed a much lighter burden on logistics. The performance of the newest batch of mech designs did not necessarily offer superior performance. In fact, many of them actually performed 5 to 25% worse. Yet what they gave up in performance, they made up for it with affordability and ease of production. By reducing the amount of rare and strategic resources that could only be obtained by importing them from distant zones, the mech designers successfully hardened their products against supply problems. Such mech designs became increasingly more favored because their producers could continue to reliably pump out products from their manufacturing complexes. The costs of these new mech models also did not grow as steeply as older designs due to their inherently greater resilience to trade disruptions. By reorienting mech designs so that their material requirements became increasingly more regional, the mech industry gradually adapted to the difficulties of the Age of Dawn. Unfortunately, the LMC was falling behind on this aspect. Gloriana and Alexa did their best to assign design teams to update their current product offerings, but it still took time to update every product line. It also did not help that VS had not come up with any major new releases for a while now. The release of the first Carmine mechs may have caused an epochal shock in the mech market, but he had failed to make the most of the boost in momentum. "It's okay," he whispered to himself. VS did not think he had wasted too much time on other affairs. Multiple mech design projects continued to make steady progress while he had achieved massive gains on other fronts. Gaining privileged access to stolen resonance technology ensured that he and his clan would not miss out on the greatest trend in the immediate future. Securing effective leadership over the Phase Lord Department solved many of his growing safety concerns. His recent actions and contributions to society all helped to raise his clout and influence. This soft power may sound nebulous and insubstantial, but VS knew better than to underestimate its importance. Yet soft power alone was not that useful. Without becoming a master mech designer or star designer, VS would always be denied a seat at the highest tables. For example, he could have taken part in the high-level discussions on how Red humanity should exploit stolen resonance technology. Yet because he was still a Tier 2 galactic citizen, he lacked the qualifications to have his voice heard. VS suddenly understood the voice of Liberty's position a lot better. Without gaining enough hard power to pose a credible threat to other big shots, he would always remain in a position where others could boss him around. This was not acceptable. He worked so hard and risked his life so many times in order to get away from such control. The entire point of founding the Larkinson clan and shaping it into an independent organization was because he wanted to gain sovereignty over his own life. While he had made enormous strides in the past decade, VS felt that he had hit the ceiling of what was currently possible for a senior mech designer. Even if he doubled the amount of ascended giants under his command, it wouldn't make much of a difference because they were only good for bullying the weak for the most part. VS scratched the side of his head. I need to make real progress. Fortunately, he could look forward to the completion of the Arboreal project. While the testing phase would likely last for at least several months, VS was already fairly happy with how fast his first elemental Carmine mech design project had progressed. He corresponded increasingly more with his Terran partners as the Blue Jay fleet approached its destination. While VS also had to help Gloriana complete the Promethea Mark II project and the Lionheart Mark II project, he did his best to put the Arboreal project front and center. Only this design project was tied to the essence of his evolving design philosophy. Completing it would effectively bring him 20% closer to his much-anticipated breakthrough as a mech designer. The designs of the basic variants of Woodsap mechs are functionally complete. The physical projection of Master Layla Rebecca DeVos explained to VS. We have solved most significant technical problems that can be detected in our trial grounds. Personally, I do not expect that their designs still retain any major faults and shortcomings. If we want to optimize them even further, we need to subject them to more realistic conditions. VS and the Terrans already agreed to do so by bringing a large batch of Woodsap mechs along their upcoming incursion into native alien space. I am glad to hear that the basic variants perform well enough so far, he said. However, we both know that the basic variants can only provide a certain amount of value to the Terran Alliance. They are not bad by any means. They will definitely be the best possible Carmine mechs that your norms can pilot once they become available. However, their production costs and other burdens heavily limit your ability to pump them out en masse. The Arboreal project had never been too restrained when it came to controlling their costs. VS and his Terran collaborators deliberately set out to prioritize quality over quantity. The Woodsap mechs had to represent the Terrans at their best, hence why it became taboo to develop a more affordable and practical variant during the design process. If consumers wanted to pilot a cheap and easy-to-obtain Carmine mech, they could already purchase the Yellow Jackets. As a prestige project, the Arboreal project had to be as far removed from the Yellow Jacket line as possible. This was why even the basic variants could achieve parity with first-class multipurpose mechs in terms of performance. While this sounded impossible due to how difficult it was for new and inexperienced Carmine mech pilots to control a mech as well as multiple weapon systems at the same time, the Arboreal project just happened to sidestep many of the complications. How has the testing gone for the Hibiscus system? VS inquired. The Hibiscus system was the current name for the old human body surrogate control system. The Hibiscus system was the current name for the old human body surrogate control system. People initially called it the HBSCS, but the Terrans detested it so much that they insisted on a more beautiful alternative. That was why the system responsible for allowing Woodsap mech pilots to control their machines as if they were moving a larger version of their own body acquired such an elegant name. Master Layla Rebecca DeVos responded with a proud expression. Better than expected. We have allocated a large amount of researchers and developers into expanding it and improving it. When we discovered that your living mechs can actually optimize the operation of the Hibiscus system on their own accord, their progress skyrocketed. I can state with certainty that it has now become the most intuitive means of controlling mechs by far. This invention alone is enough to shock the entire mech community almost just as much as when you initially unveiled the Carmine system. This was not an exaggeration. Many prospective Carmine mech pilots were still stuck in training because it took years for them to control their Yellow Jackets at a reasonable degree of effectiveness. While it was already considered fast for them to be able to participate in serious combat within a span of just 5 years, Red humanity couldn't afford to wait so long. The Hibiscus system offered to cut this training time by at least 80% when paired with trained and experienced infantry troopers. The Terrans had already put many of its elite infantry soldiers into accelerated learning programs. The most brilliant among them had already learned most of the theory related to operating spaceborne mechs. So long as the Arboreal project proved to be a massive success, the Terrans would most definitely seek to expand its manpower pool by putting more infantry soldiers through retraining. Initial testing with the prototype Woodsap mech showed that the Hibiscus system could already achieve enough equivalency that most soldiers could translate their existing combat skills in their larger forms. From their descriptions, the test pilots all made it sound as if they had become lesser phase lords instead of mech pilots. Though this analogy was not accurate, it was a quick and easy way to understand how much the Hibiscus system changed the equation. Without this incredible control system, there was no way to make the Woodsap mechs ready for use when paired with norms. The only way to make them ready for actual combat was to pair them with existing mech pilots. However, that defeated the purpose of employing Carmine mechs. Potentates did not have to tie their entire careers to a single machine. In many cases, it was much better for them to stick to regular mechs that lacked the restrictions and additional complications imposed by Carmine mechs. Whatever the case, the Hibiscus system was so powerful that VS even thought about applying it to other mech design projects. Unfortunately, VS did not have the right to do as he wished. The Hibiscus system was an exclusive Terran invention. He barely involved himself in its development. He did not understand its core biotechnical principles. His only meaningful contribution was helping to integrate it into the design of his Woodsap mechs. Perhaps he might be able to make a separate deal with the Terrans, but that depended on how grateful they felt towards him. Even then, they may still decide to keep the Hibiscus system to themselves due to its undeniable strategic value. Pity. VS forced himself to suppress his greed towards the Hibiscus system. He needed to focus on what was attainable. Chapter 7409, The Potency of Woodsap. Chapter 7409, The Potency of Woodsap. Placeholder 1. The Arboreal project already promised to become a line of groundbreaking products due to the combination of the Woodsap system and the Hibiscus system. The former eliminated the need for a compatible genetic aptitude. The latter removed the need to learn a large amount of specialized piloting skills. This effectively turned the Arboreal project into the right solution at the right time. As long as the Terran Alliance could afford to produce enough Woodsap mechs, they could easily mobilize hundreds of thousands if not millions of biomechs whose performance came quite close to matching that of regular first-class mechs. Although early testing already revealed that norms that lacked formal mech piloting training could never match the rigor and precision of real mech pilots, the gap between the two was not as big as everyone feared. Even if Woodsap mech pilots could only be half as effective as proper academy-graduated first-class mech pilots, that was still a positive outcome from the perspective of a large star empire. Let alone converting elite infantry soldiers into Woodsap mech pilots, the Terran Alliance also thought about turning low-aptitude mech pilots into the same. Though few people liked to talk about it in the open, the truth was that many potentates actually possessed disappointing genetic aptitudes. Once they learned that they lacked the talent to flourish on the battlefield, most young potentates painfully gave up on attending a mech academy and chose to pursue more mundane careers. However, there was always a small but stubborn group of stubborn mules that persisted in becoming mech pilots. Even if they had no choice but to attend inferior mech academies, their willpower and determination often attracted admiration. Not that it made much of a difference in the end. Their theoretical scores may be high, but so long as their practical scores hit a low ceiling, such mech pilots rarely got hired as a consequence. While many of them tried their best to make themselves useful by specializing in mech command or choosing to pilot industrial mechs, it was very difficult for them to gain a chance to fulfill their dreams of becoming proper fighters. Carmine mechs and the upcoming Woodsap mechs offered a brand new opportunity to them. For the first time in their lives, they gained the ability to pilot real combat mechs without getting held back by their disappointing genetic aptitudes. This not only meant that they could make proper use of their decade-long academy training, but also put their superior willpower and discipline to good use. Pilots forged from adversity always had a higher chance of breaking through. While many members of the mech community understood this simple truth, few people wanted to invest in low-aptitude mech pilots. Their superior mentality made them desirable, but if they could never unleash more than 20% of their potential due to being held back by their inability to smoothly control their own mechs, then what was the point? Many parties had experimented with trying to promote the breakthroughs of low-aptitude mech pilots over the centuries. The effort never paid off. In practically each and every case, the low performance of these low-aptitude mech pilots served as an enormous drag for any mech unit. Yet the probability of this happening was so low that the payoff could never make up for the investment. The math simply did not make sense. This time was different. It did not escape the notice of the Terrans that Carmine mechs, and more importantly Woodsap mechs, had the potential to effectively negate the single most important factor that held them back. For this reason, the Terrans had already approached a batch of mech pilots with C, D and in a few cases E-grade genetic aptitudes and convinced them to take part in this great experiment. So long as the outcome was successful, these once demoralized mech pilots could finally unlock their potential and compete fairly against the peers they once envied. However, no matter whether it was norms or low-aptitude potentates, both of them still faced a harsh requirement: physical augmentation. Both baseline and regular augmented humans could never pilot a Woodsap mech under normal conditions. The special tree sap that flowed through the veins of the Woodsap system was pure poison to most humanoid physiques. The only way for a human body to tolerate this toxic substance was to accept radical biological modifications. Last VS checked, the test pilots who had volunteered for the experimental processes had successfully gained compatibility with the Woodsap system, but tragically lost parts of their humanity in the process. He grew curious about whether the Terrans had made any progress in mitigating this serious issue. The projection of Master Rebecca Layla DeVos maintained a neutral expression. We fully realize the importance of solving this problem. We have allocated more top researchers to this subproject and tripled their funding. It is too much to expect them to produce an acceptable solution in so little time, but our investment has not been in vain. They have already developed numerous improvements to the process that have yielded significantly more positive results. She transmitted a video file that displayed the state of the latest batch of test subjects. Compared to the earlier batches, the new crop of WhatsApp mech pilots did not display as many tree-like aspects. They looked a lot more like normal humans, though their hair still contained branches and green leaves. When the test pilots moved around, VS paid close attention to their nimbleness and reaction speed. They no longer behave as literal half-plants anymore, he said. That is already an enormous improvement in my opinion. While it is clear that they are still affected by their extensive changes, I don't think that this level of debilitation is unacceptable. They move like aged pensioners. Which is still unacceptable, Master Rebecca DeVos sternly responded. WhatsApp mech pilots are meant to represent the might and prestige of the Terran Alliance. We do not demand total perfection, but we insist that they meet a high standard regardless. Every test pilot has been carefully selected based on fitness and other criteria. They are all supposed to be at the peak of their physicality within their current age brackets. The operations are not meant to impair their health by any means. These biological shortcomings must be solved as much as possible before the day we debut the Arboreal project. Good luck on that. VS might not possess a deep understanding of the science behind human augmentation, but he still believed that humans must always pay a price to gain compatibility with WhatsApp. The white, milky substance was simply too harmful and alien. WhatsApp contained a strong concentration of life and wood energies. It also contained hundreds of strange and exotic molecules, many of which possessed specialized functions that could not be removed without impairing the effectiveness of the original substance. As a life liquid derived from the emperor tree, WhatsApp was a higher-order substance that was much more powerful than ordinary human blood. This was the source of a WhatsApp mech strength, as well as the catalyst that enabled WhatsApp mech pilots to exert power far beyond regular Carmine mech pilots. VS looked forward to observing and studying the differences between the two groups in person. The early tests already showed massive differences, but he knew that there was more to WhatsApp mech pilots than what the Terrans could measure with their high-tech instruments. Perhaps it is not my place to judge, but I do not think that most people will mind that the first-generation WhatsApp mech pilots behave a little oddly in comparison to normal Terran citizens. VS ultimately said, I doubt that your researchers can produce any further optimizations quickly after they have addressed all of the low-hanging fruit. I think it will require a much more dedicated effort to truly retain all of the humanity of our WhatsApp mech pilots. I think it may be better to postpone this goal for the second generation of WhatsApp mechs. We should not aim too high. Master DeVos clearly looked like she disagreed, but she did not contradict him openly. We will consider it after we have observed the situation for a couple more weeks. The top researchers should not be underestimated. Our biotech sector is much greater and more formidable than that of other human powers. In fact, we have yet to employ our most effective measures. There are still leaders among us who foolishly believe that maintaining confidentiality is more important than utilizing our best tools at this stage of the war. VS could understand the sentiment. The Terran Alliance was being hard-pressed by the native aliens, but the situation had not deteriorated in the worst-case scenario. Not yet, at least. Chapter 7410 Native Alien Superdrives. Chapter 7410 Native Alien Superdrives. VS actually knew that the Terrans secretly thought about solving the physicality problem of WhatsApp mech pilots by turning to an unconventional source of help. However, the Terrans strangely kept this initiative out of their reports. He found that very peculiar. He felt tempted to address this matter, but he refrained from doing so at this time. VS knew that the Terrans always put great care in their actions. If they kept out an important initiative from their reports, then they had good reasons to do so. They likely did not want to mention any of it over an unsecure communication channel. Perhaps the Terrans may decide to enlighten him when he arrived at his destination. As the Blue Jay fleet continued to traverse across the territories of the Terran Alliance, it frequently came across scenes of both prosperity and panic. The colonists and clans who originated from the Greater Terran United Confederation had been wealthy beyond reason. When they chose to pack up their bags and emigrate to the new frontier, they often brought more than they strictly needed to start up a new life. Many of them understood that they could make much better use of the boundless new opportunities if they possessed an abundant amount of capital and assets. Though it was true that the Great Severing had bankrupted many pioneers and organizations that had relied too heavily on support from the old galaxy, those that had truly committed to the Red Ocean mostly managed to find their footing in the New Age. Now, many of them had become entrepreneurs and industrialists who rode the wave of militarism throughout human-occupied space. Civilian industries suffered a steep decline as the needs of the military outweighed ordinary comforts. A large amount of regional trade and shipping had been established around strategic port systems and industrial systems throughout the various zones. Of course, the closer to the front lines, the greater the prevalence of armed convoys. The native aliens keenly understood how much their human foes depended on logistics to sustain their war-making potential. Much of the resistance at the front lines could be attributed to how well the humans could supply their flagging defenders with fresh troops and supplies. In fact, when the Blue Jay fleet exited FTL travel in a star system that was situated close to the front lines, many long-range sensor systems immediately picked up the presence of alien raiders, most of which consisted of relatively common modest-sized Nunzer homeships. It was a relatively modest force comprising about a dozen subcapital ships and a few companies of phase fighters. The Blue Jay fleet could easily crush this hostile force, but the problem was that they were separated by a distance of over 5 light hours. Can we catch up to them? VS asked from the moment he arrived at the command center of the Tarask. Admiral Gori Tensen maintained a tense expression. It depends. The native aliens of today are not the same as the ones we fought at the start of the Red War. We know from prior intelligence that the cosmopolitan movement has leaked the designs of our superdrives to the major alien races of the Red Ocean years ago. The native aliens have been relatively slow to adopt our tech, mostly because they are unfamiliar with Milky Way-style FTL drives. However, they are too enamored by their speeds to hold themselves back for long. They have already begun to install them onto their core fleets as well as many of their commerce raiding flotillas. Depending on their ratings and other factors, FTL drives and by extension superdrives did not necessarily have to be expensive to produce. So long as the native aliens understood their technological principles, it should be easy enough to adapt the new drives to their existing homeships. However, most of the major alien races had a huge amount of vessels. They did not have the production capacity to upgrade all of their hulls throughout the entire dwarf galaxy. The enemy leaders could only set priorities and focus on upgrading the ships of greater importance and most in need. This was why most alien raiding fleets still relied on old and outdated warp drives. The various alien civilizations did not bother to upgrade these aging hulls with modern superdrives because they were bound to get destroyed shortly after assaulting human-occupied space. This actually gave many people the impression that the native aliens were terribly slow at adopting new technologies. While there was a kernel of truth in this assumption, it did not apply equally to every alien group. The raiding fleets surprisingly received priority on this particular upgrade. This was the only way for them to become effective at their jobs. Not only could they easily catch up to slow and bulky transportation vessels, they could also outrun most human retaliation forces. Given that this particular alien raiding force had penetrated relatively further into Terran space than was typical, there was a great chance that its vessels were all equipped with superdrives. Granted, the quality and performance of those superdrives were probably mediocre at best. The native aliens still treated their raiding ships as disposable after all. The ships only had to inflict enough damage and disruption to human shipping before they inevitably got cornered and shot to pieces. The question now was whether the Blue Jay fleet should intervene. It is not worth the effort for us to pursue this enemy force, Admiral Tensen ultimately judged. We can easily clean them up by sending a handful of giants aboard a squadron of fast ships, but the pursuit will last for days if not weeks. I have no doubt that our fastest vessels will be able to catch up by virtue of their superior superdrives and technologies, but we will miss their presence when we have already started our incursion into hostile territory. VS thought about it. Leaving this raiding flotilla alone might end up causing damage to nearby Terran convoys. Not all of them were large enough to be able to fend off a hostile force of this size. Nonetheless, the Blue Jay fleet had its own mission. It was not responsible for defending Terran space per se. The Terran Alliance was responsible for its own internal security. You're right, I suppose. Report it to the Terrans and let's move on. VS decided. I really wish we had a much faster and more convenient means to strike this fleet, but we lack this capability. We do not have any means of teleporting across a distance of 5 light hours. That might not be true in the future. VS could easily foresee the development of short-ranged and medium-range teleportation tech in the coming decades. The existence of superdimensional matter could definitely facilitate this power, though he had very little clue how it could be done through scientific means. Although VS possessed the capacity to teleport across short distances by relying on his identity as a phase lord, the maximum range was dismal in relation to the current situation. The Blue Jay fleet eventually moved on after reporting the sighting to the Terran authorities. Not that it mattered. The star system was most definitely littered with hidden Terran listening devices, and passing human vessels had probably transmitted their own sightings of the hostile force. Regardless, the encounter put every soldier on edge. They no longer maintained the relaxed demeanor of before and all gained an edge that clearly conveyed their readiness to fight at the drop of the hat. It had only been a relatively short time since they last fought the native aliens, but that did not mean that everything remained the same. Just as with the case of superdrives, the major alien races had steadily adopted other stolen technologies, some of which they generously applied to their disposable assault fleets. Just before the Blue Jay fleet was about to rendezvous with the Larkinson clan's premier fleet, VS and a handful of others paid a visit to the only Larkinson ace pilot within his reach. The Riot Mark III is still in a relatively uncertain state. Gloriana reported to her husband with an expression that conveyed her mild frustration. It can still be called a mech of sorts, but it occasionally behaves as if it is made out of organic materials. Repairing it has turned out to be a greater nightmare than I thought. Repairing the largest and most obvious forms of battle damage is easy enough. It is the smaller faults and deviations that have proven stubborn to our ministrations. There are many times when this living mech simply refused to give us access or allow our corrections to persist. VS was not too surprised after hearing this. He had heard his wife complain about the idiosyncrasies of the powerful D-Mech more than once. As he looked up at the mostly dormant machine, he knew that it was actually a lot more active and poised than it looked. A D-Mech was never stable. Saint Orphan's willpower constantly had to fight to suppress the powerful influence of its middle demon. It was precisely due to the mutual hatred between the ace pilot and her own machine that the Riot Mark III could never achieve total stability. Even now, its surface components subtly shifted and mutated before his eyes. This was just one of many signs that the Ace Spearman mech remained susceptible to the powerful influence of its own controllers. There was no single master to the Riot Mark III. How is its current condition? VS inquired. It is difficult to determine a precise figure, but my estimate is that its physical condition has only reached 92% of its theoretical peak condition. His wife responded. It is close enough to undamaged that you will hardly notice any drop to its performance, but that does not mean its deterioration can be ignored. The Riot Mark III is more susceptible to crippling attacks than before. This will mostly be felt if it faces a powerful opponent again. In other words, the D-Mech was not able to fulfill its primary purpose as effectively as before. VS originally designed it to confront champions of similar or greater power, but that became a lot more precarious if the living mech still retained so many battle scars. VS placed his hands on his hips. He did not see an easy means to remedy this situation aside from asking the Prophet's Bane to cease its resistance. Given its incredibly hostile and hateful personality, the chance of that happening was close to zero. How is Saint Orphan? Her condition is not good, Gloriana straightforwardly answered. She is still suffering from the sequelae of her last battle. The times where she is awake and lucid are depressingly rare. She is mostly in a state of dormancy. It is similar enough to being asleep, I suppose. Sleep manifested much differently when it came to Saint Rosa Orphan. She had functionally lost her original human body, so she no longer rested from a physiological perspective. However, her mental state endured much greater pressure due to her constant warring against her own D-Mech. No human could withstand so much pressure, not even a being that had become a saint. Saint Orphan therefore needed to rest much more frequently than other ace pilots. She could easily sleep for days or weeks at a time without needing to wake up, as it simply was not necessary anymore. After all, there was no need for her to quench her thirst, void her bowels, or keep her muscles in shape. She was no longer burdened by her human frailties. Though that initially sounded like an advantage, VS did not think this way. Every human was afflicted by basic physiological needs. To lose them was to lose an essential part of one's humanity. While God pilots had already evolved far enough that they could easily go without these mortal vestiges, VS was not certain that the same applied to junior ace pilots. He constantly worried about whether Rosa Orphan would still remain as human as before each time she woke up again. How many years would she able to last before she bore a closer resemblance to a monster than a human? Chapter 74:11 Recycling Conflict Energies. Chapter 74:11 Recycling Conflict Energies. Though the Riot Mark III's mutations and resistance to physical modifications frustrated Gloriana, VS did not entirely see this as a purely detrimental situation. From the perspective of his design philosophy, the Riot Mark III had evolved. It had moved along an unknown track. Whether the ultimate destination was good or bad remained to be seen, but at least the living mech moved forward. VS interpreted that as progress. Who was he to judge whether the Riot Mark III's autonomous evolution was beneficial or detrimental? He did not blindly assume that the current changes were all bad. He personally believed that the physical changes reflected its spiritual evolution. What truly mattered was the struggle for dominance between its two dominant controllers. Saint Orphan endured a lot of mental pressure during the last battle. She partially lost control and gave in to the darkness of her own demon. During the period where her extraordinary willpower not only became exhausted, but also incurred damage, her own D-Mech managed to deepen its grip on her soul a little further. This was the main reason why the ace pilot was forced into dormancy after the battle. She needed to plug the holes in her defenses as quickly as possible while also attempting to regain as much lost ground as possible. How do you think she is faring? Gloriana asked her husband, knowing that his perception on these matters exceeded that of everyone. VS furrowed his brows. It's complicated. She has suffered a setback on the surface, but this is also a valuable learning experience. I can feel her indignation and determination. She is angry at her own failings, but instead letting them drag her down, she is more motivated to conquer them than ever. Her unconscious resistance against her adversarial mech is changing due to the influence of her willpower. The Riot Mark III had always been engulfed by an invisible storm. It originated from the irreconcilable conflict between a saint and a middle demon. Any change within the system could produce significant changes in the expression of that storm. Will she be all right? I cannot say. VS shrugged. So far, it seems that she will recover in time to participate in the upcoming campaign, but that assumes that the current pattern holds. If there is one thing about the Riot Mark III that we should know, it is that this mech is never designed to be predictable. It is an incarnation of chaos fashioned by our hands and minds. We know better than most that this work has a much greater chance of catching us off guard than all of our other works combined. He kind of understood why his wife treated the Riot Mark III as a pseudo-biomech. The D-mech was more alive than other machines. Its highly malleable and mutable physical form introduced a lot of complications that were characteristically associated with biomechs. Even then, biomechs did not exhibit as much chaos and instability as the Riot. So what do you suggest we do, VS? I believe in Rosa's resilience, but she is clearly not in a good state at the moment, and will remain so for a time. Do you think we should give her more time to recover or subject her to additional stimulation? VS thought about it for a moment. If you want my honest opinion, I do not think that the Riot Mark III is meant to remain dormant and static all of the time. Even if Saint Orphan and her Demecha's conditions are less than ideal, the solution is not to put them away. In fact, I think the opposite is better. I believe it may be better to throw them onto the battlefield at the first possible opportunity. Our work is meant to thrive in chaos, and Saint Orphan won't be able to beat the Prophet's Bane by staying on the defensive all of the time. Only by exposing her to constant pressure and stimulation will she be able to accelerate her growth rate and prevent her demon from surpassing her in overall strength. Do not forget that she is living on a timer. Unlike many other mech pilots, Rosa Orphan did not have a choice anymore. She could not turn away from her own D-mech due to establishing a corrupted version of a blood pact. VS had already taken to labeling it as a D-pact. The difference between the two was obvious. The blood pact established a symbiotic relationship between man and machine. To put it differently, if one side prospered, the other side benefited as well. The two had every reason to cooperate with each other. There was little to no basis for conflict between the two. Harming one meant harming oneself. The D-pact, on the other hand, forced two less than amiable partners together in a competitive relationship. The man might be willing to cooperate, but the demonic machine could never let go of its hostility against the other. As long as neither side could agree with each other, they were locked in an all-or-nothing struggle where the victor claimed everything while the inferior party lost everything. Too much was at stake for either side to give up or make compromises. The unflinching and unshakable hostility from the D-mech ensured that the bonded pilot could never relax. In this special case, harming the other directly benefited oneself. As long as this dynamic remained, peace could never exist between the mech pilot and the D-mech. Though VS already figured this out in theory before he upgraded the Riot to its current incarnation, it had always sounded abstract in his mind. It was only when he stood before the Riot Mark III and observed the dire implications and consequences in person that he realized the full magnitude behind his terrible invention. He could never take this matter as lightly as before. Seeing Saint Orphan suffer to this extent with a D-mech that he had formed only recently caused VS to have a lot more misgivings about demon casting. Just because Rosa Orphan herself agreed to bind her soul to an adversarial mech did not necessarily make this right. VS knew quite well that he had never given her a truly honest explanation due to his vested interest in creating his first true D-mech. He also felt a little guilty for preying on the known vulnerabilities of his target audience. He had known that Rosa Orphan had long been frustrated by her lack of progress and took advantage of her desperation. Though he ultimately managed to give her what she wanted, the price she paid was much heavier than it should. In fact, she was paying for her devil's bargain to this very day. Wait a second. Gloriana was quite sensitive towards her husband. She quickly recognized the look on his face. Have you come up with another brilliant and insane idea again, VS? VS raised a finger. Give me a moment. I need to put my thoughts in order. The more he looked at the Riot Mark III, the more he felt he was viewing a dynamic system rather than a static system. By dynamic, he meant an object that always remained in motion. This might sound strange as Saint Orphan was currently asleep while the Ace Mech remained frozen in motion, but all of that stood in stark contrast to the never-ending war between the two entities. Since this conflict generated so much friction, was there a way to repurpose, recycle, or divert all of this energy? The extraordinary willpower of an ace pilot, even a junior one, was quite formidable. Something similar applied to the demonic power of a middle demon. VS found it quite wasteful for the two of them to constantly collide their energies against each other for no other purpose than to engage in a long-term turf war. While this conflict was important enough to mean the difference between liberation and annihilation, there was no way for them to resolve this war in the short term. Since that was the case, why not take advantage of this constant tension and divert all of the spare energies into a different application? The question now was what this supposed application should look like. A number of ideas came to mind. Should he develop a modification that diverted the conflicting energies into the D-Mecha's signature Chaos Armor? That sounded like a disaster in the making. The Chaos Armor jointly developed by Jovi Armelon was one of the principal sources of chaos and instability in the mech. Nurturing it and amplifying its power way beyond its current level could result in catastrophic consequences. In fact, Saint Orphan was already struggling to keep her own machine in good shape and under as it is. This was not the right time to permanently increase her burden. What about the Chaos Trigger? That was an even worse idea. Pulling the Chaos Trigger may have granted Saint Orphan a huge boost in power, but that came paired with an equivalent drop in control. Considering the fact that she was still suffering from the negative consequences of activating the Riot's ultimate module, VS did not believe it was a good idea to make this double-edged sword even sharper. Other ideas came to mind, but VS quickly dismissed them. This was because strengthening any aspect of the Riot Mark III directly or indirectly empowered its demonic spirit, which would ultimately make it far too difficult for Saint Orphan to remain in control. Since VS could not choose to strengthen any single aspect of the Riot Mark III, what else could he choose to divert all of that conflicting energies? A promising suggestion came to mind. The Tier 3 Destroyer Spear. VS did not bother to look around for the powerful weapon container. Out of safety reasons, they always placed the high-tier destroyer weapon as far away from the Riot Mark III as possible during periods of calm. Nonetheless, the physical absence of this Terran weapon did not diminish its importance in his eyes. VS thought about what would happen if he created a working mechanism whereby the mutual struggle between Saint Orphan and the Riot Mark III constantly fed the weapon with energy. How would the destroyer weapon react? Would it try to annihilate the foreign energies? Or was there a way to persuade the spear to absorb them instead? How would the Tier 3 Destroyer Spear grow as a result of absorbing the mixed energies? What were the consequences of absorbing the willpower of an ace pilot and the demonic energy of a middle demon at the same time? VS could not readily answer all of these questions. But that was fine. What was important was that VS had come up with a completely new direction of research. His eyes lit up even as the others grew perplexed at his latest burst of inspiration. VS did not care for their opinions. His mind had already been set on his latest experimental side project. Though it would take time to develop a proper solution, it shouldn't take too much time for him to conduct a few rudimentary tests. He needed to understand the interactions between Saint Orphan, the Riot Mark III, and the Tier 3 Destroyer Spear much better. By selectively exposing the latter with the energies of the former, he would be able to find out whether his latest idea had any merit. If he could verify his hypothesis, he could work towards developing a proof of concept that could possibly enable the Tier 3 Destroyer Spear to grow alongside its users. However, VS had to proceed cautiously because destroyer weapons were much more dangerous than regular weapons. It ultimately came down to how the destroyer particles would react to eternal stimuli and whether VS could regulate their behavior in any meaningful fashion. It was nearly impossible to tame destroyer particles, especially in higher concentrations. VS feared that the solution he had in mind would only work for lower-tier destroyer weapons. Though a Tier 3 Destroyer Spear did not rank at the top of what this weapon type could reach, it was already an extraordinary creation on its own. It would be arrogant to assume that he would be able to tame its infamous aggression with a couple of easy fixes. Chapter 74:12 Assembling a Team. Chapter 74:12 Assembling a Team. VS knew that this was not the time for him to indulge in his latest innovation spree, but he couldn't help it. If he did not act on his current bout of inspiration, he doubted he would be able to transform a daydream into a practical application in record time. Besides, it was not as if his presence was necessary in the next few days. He was not responsible for the planning related to the upcoming campaign. Saint Commander Casella Ingvar Larkinson took charge of this effort. She allocated a whole staff department or two towards information gathering and analysis. They probably knew 100 times more details about the enemies up ahead. As for his highly anticipated meeting with the Terran developers and test pilots related to the Arboreal project, they had already been waiting for this for months. It shouldn't matter too much if they waited a couple of days more. What truly mattered right now was to link the Tier 3 Destroyer Spear to Saint Orphan and the Riot Mark III in a new and different way. This was not as easy as it sounded. Neither of the three elements truly got along with each other. The mutual hostility between the ace pilot and the D-Mech needed no further explanation. The high-tier destroyer weapon might not truly be alive, but it definitely possessed enough traits to be able to express universal hostility towards anyone, no matter whether they were friend or foe. In fact, VS doubted that destroyer weapons could ever establish any friendships. They treated everything as foes, including itself. The destroyer particles that served as the source of their destructive power were so active and destructive that they even repelled each other. The Terrans exploited this key trait to create their iconic destroyer weapons. Through means that VS still did not understand, they produced destroyer particles and attempted to stuff as many of them into weapons as possible. The amount of effort they put in the latter determined the tier of the resulting destroyer weapons. At low concentrations, the weapons gained a destructive edge, but still remained relatively usable by ordinary wielders. It was at higher concentrations that their lethality became increasingly more exaggerated. The weapons grew more extraordinary but also more dangerous to hold. There were good reasons why Tier 5 destroyers' weapons and higher could only be wielded by high-ranking mech pilots. It took a lot of willpower to forcibly suppress the destructive impulses of the weapon and channel them towards enemies. This was relatively common sense to anyone familiar with destroyer weapons. However, VS began to question whether this assumption was truly as absolute as everyone thought. Is there a way to reduce the hostility of a destroyer weapon towards oneself? This was a profound question. He bet that a lot of Terran experts in destroyer weapons had asked the same question. VS did not know whether they managed to develop a solution that successfully mitigated the harm that these armaments posed towards their wielders. He doubted that the Terrans would give him an honest answer if he asked them directly. It doesn't matter. He was not looking to replicate the solutions of others, if they existed at all. If he was being honest to himself, he actually knew nothing beyond the basics of Terran destroyer technology. This way, he could peel back the layers of secrets that made it so dangerous and effective on his own terms. As VS began to rub his hands in anticipation, he mentally composed and refined his development plan. His first conclusion was that he probably wouldn't be able to complete this side project in a timely manner by himself. It was not strictly necessary for him to resort to outside help, but it would make a lot of stuff more convenient. He could also draw on the expertise of his helpers to assist him in fields that did not hold his interest. Working together with others would make it a little more difficult for VS to maintain his flow, but that was all right. He was confident enough in his leadership ability to keep them in line. He proceeded to make a selection. Gloriana? Hell no. She's too busy, anyway. Alexa? She is always helpful. Xanther? This falls outside his specialization, but studying destroyer weapons up close will do him a lot of good. Aside from Alexa and Xanther, VS also thought hard on whether he should invite other Larkinson journeymen to take part in his side project. They all had their own strengths, but not all of them were relevant for his purposes. Working together with them would not only make VS more familiar with them, but also allow him to gauge whether they were suitable to induct them into the mech designer system. He ultimately narrowed down his selection to Meryl O'Brien, Cormount Hempcamp, and Kelsey Ampatok. Once he finalized his selection, he invited all of them to a spare meeting room and quickly explained the premise of his side project to the mech designers. They all looked a bit bewildered. The invitation to help VS in his development project arrived so randomly that they felt ambushed. Why me? Xanther asked. I am not an expert in melee weapons. That is true, but don't you want to tinker around with destroyer weapons and examine destroyer particles up close? This is your chance to do so. VS responded with a grin. As a journeyman, you do not necessarily have to stick to studying the most relevant fields of your specialization. I am not saying that it is a bad idea, but stepping outside your comfort zone may allow you to get exposed to phenomena that can ultimately birth a radical new idea in your mind. That is how I often get my own inspiration from. This will be a good learning experience whether we succeed or fail. What about the rest of us, sir? Meryl, you are here because you are a rational mech designer. I know you can't simulate many design philosophies yet, but we need your contrasting approach to mech design and engineering to address any problems that we have overlooked. The relatively young woman nodded in acceptance. VS had never paid too much attention to Meryl because she connected a lot more with Gloriana. Though Meryl often maintained a relatively low profile in the design department, VS was still vaguely aware of her progress. She was a rational mech designer in a similar vein to that of the polymath. This meant that she did not possess an inherent design philosophy, but trained herself into simulating the design philosophies of other mech designers. That included V's own design philosophy. Getting employed by the Larkinson clan and working on living mech designs for multiple years had significantly increased her understanding of what she was working with. She could imitate V's design philosophy at the level of a journeyman mech designer to a very convincing degree these days. That was incredibly helpful because she was developing into an increasingly more adequate substitute of himself. In addition, Meryl had also become quite competent at imitating Gloriana's design philosophy. While she was not yet proficient in architect or other advanced subjects, it was no problem for the journeyman to imitate Gloriana's more basic quality-oriented design applications. Of course, Meryl never intended to become a shadow of VS or Gloriana. Her ambitions were greater than that. She had worked to become better at imitating other design philosophies, taking particular care to develop specializations in fields that were not common within the design department. Though rational mech designers infamously needed a huge amount of time to live up to their potential, Meryl was gradually approaching that point. If she ever gained access to the mech designer system, then she could become a much more powerful design asset for the Larkinson clan in much less time. That was the main reason why VS wanted to bring Meryl aboard his side project. He had a feeling that Meryl may have figured that out by herself. Just because she was low-key did not mean she was blind. In fact, the opposite may be true. She had to be incredibly observant if she wanted to become a good rational mech designer. Hempcamp, your specialization in neural interfaces is not directly related to the current project. But what I need from you is your broader understanding on how individuals and objects interact with each other. I need you to look beyond the confines of neural interface technology and help develop a new interface that can successfully bind a destroyer weapon to the Ace Pilot and Ace Mech. The journeyman looked troubled. This is not a light challenge, sir. I am afraid you are overestimating my abilities. I will try my best to facilitate your work and put my expertise to use, but I cannot give any guarantees. That is okay. I am aware of your limitations. Just give it a try. Perhaps you may still be able to make a number of key suggestions. This is a team effort, so I expect everyone to contribute in their own way. You don't necessarily have to take a leading role. Serving in an assisting capacity is already helpful enough. Cormount Hempcamp looked a little more relaxed after hearing that. He had been afraid that VS would hold him to high standards. VS finally turned to Kelsey Ampatok. He had been recruited a little later than the rest, and therefore possessed abilities that were a cut above the rest. As for you, I am sure you can figure out your purpose. Your design philosophy is made for seeking vulnerabilities. That is exactly what we will need. I think you can be a great help discovering and exploiting possible loopholes in the systems we are working with. I need you to put your ingenuity to use. Kelsey nodded with confidence. I see. You have chosen the right mech designer. St. Rosa Orphan, the Riot Mark III, and the Tier 3 Destroyer Spear are all incredibly strong and highly complex sources of power that all operate according to their own rules. These rules may be internally consistent, but often do not perfectly mesh with other rule sets. Contact between three of them at the same time is bound to produce holes that no one has ever anticipated. So long as we look closely enough, we may be able to discover one or two within a day. Though Kelsey Ampatok sounded a bit overconfident, VS did not really mind his attitude. It was better to be optimistic than the other way around. Seeing that everyone was clear about their responsibilities, VS began to hand out more specific assignments to them. Each of them needed to conduct different forms of research in order to advance their latest project as efficiently as possible. After asking a few more questions, they split up and went to work. While not all of them believed in his latest obsession, they did not intend to slack off in front of the most important mech designer of their clan. VS was not too certain about it, but he suspected that the lead designers had gained at least a vague awareness of a huge but secret benefit. Perhaps the signs were not too obvious, but it was very plain to see that VS and anyone he favored eventually broke past the limitations of their rank and became a lot more competent in their work. This pattern was pretty clear to see when studying Gloriana and Keddy's at work. Although Alexa had yet to enjoy the benefits of the system long enough, her attitude after getting inducted into the system had changed in a profound way. Though she had tried her best to control herself with the help of her upbringing, there was no way for a mech designer to hide the growth in her passion, confidence, and enthusiasm. Perhaps that was why the mech designers invited into the team took this initiative a lot more seriously than they should. Chapter 74-13 Heir of Death. Chapter 74-13 Heir of Death. Once the team started on their tasks, VS decided to take another look at the Tier 3 Destroyer Spear. He already studied it a few times before, but it did not hurt to take another glimpse. Perhaps he might be able to uncover a hidden facet or gain new inspiration. Studying the Tier 3 Destroyer Spear was not a trivial matter, though. A high-tier destroyer weapon was a dangerous object and had a habit of eroding its surroundings. Just removing it from its container put a lot of stress on the Tarask's shield generators and other nearby implements. Even if the powerful armament behaved at the moment, there was no guarantee that it would remain this way. VS did not take this danger lightly and maintained a respectful distance from the weapon now that it had been taken out of its protective container. Papa! Meow! An unexpected pair decided to drop by at this time. VS interrupted observations and turned around to hug the girl that had confidently jumped in his arms. Andraste, why are you here? Don't you know how dangerous it is to approach this section of the ship? The young girl kissed his cheek before she adopted an earnest grin. That's exactly why I wanted to take a look. Destroyer weapons are so powerful. I really want to see one up close. Maybe I even want to request one as a birthday gift. She definitely had a purpose in mind. Destroyer weapons generated a lot of fascination among people. Even the rise of superdimensional weapons had not significantly harmed the prestige of this signature Terran weapons technology. In fact, Many people expected that the combination between destroyer technology and superdimensional technology could produce an incredibly amazing result. While such a development was at least several years away from realization, Andraste did not think so much. She just wanted to take a very good look at the weapon that Rosa Orphan used to demolish the Ixith Goliath and put up a valiant fight against the Voice of Liberty. VS still held Andraste in his arms even as she gazed at the destroyer weapons beyond the protective screens. Meow! Lucky meanwhile floated around while keeping a protective eye on the little Larkin son. The gem cat appeared relaxed, but he still took his duties seriously. He could easily drag the girl back if an accident ever occurred. So what do you think, my cute little pumpkin? Andraste expressed genuine interest and fascination as she observed the floating weapon. The as-of-yet named destroyer spear never truly rested. Even in its relatively dormant state, its spear tip still generated a leaking corona of destructive energies that constantly tried to wear down the nearby Azure energy shields. The Tarrasque had to divert a significant amount of energy just to contain the weapon's destructive effects. After a few more seconds of quiet contemplation, the girl finally attempted to articulate her feelings. It is really powerful. Even I can feel it from this distance. All of my danger instincts are warning me to stay away. I am not even close to ready to wield this weapon. Would you like to do so one day? Andraste shook her head. Sort of. I don't want to take Rosa's weapon away from her. I want to wield my own destroyer sword. If you truly want to, you might get your chance one day. VS smiled back at his second daughter. It is not easy for me to get my hands on the high-tier stuff though. The low-tier stuff is a lot more common, especially at the infantry scale. Still, it is best to wait a while before the Terrans have successfully developed a superdimensional version of their iconic weapons. Combining the extraordinary cutting power of superdimensional matter with the all-encompassing destructive potential of destroyer particles will definitely result in a fusion that cannot be resisted by anyone. While that might sound like an exaggeration, it shouldn't be too far from the truth. Perhaps only true gods would be able to defend against direct attacks from such armaments. His girl certainly looked enamored by the possibility of wielding such a magical weapon. She was a miniature swordswoman, all right. As one of Ketty's biggest fans and student, Andraste no longer thought about pursuing other passions aside from maybe marksmanship, and even that played second fiddle to her pure and genuine love for swordsmanship. Maw! Yaika emerged from the red-haired girl's head. The partially grown kitten maintained a curious expression as she single-mindedly gazed at the Tier 3 destroyer spear. What is it, Andraste? My companion spirit's perception is special, she replied. Yaika is a lot more connected to death, just like Auntie Helena. She can feel a subtle air of death infused within the spear. It is not easy to distinguish it from all of the other harmful energy, but it is definitely present. Oh, that sounds interesting. VS grew intrigued. Can you tell me more? Is there anything special about this air of death? And is it affecting the weapon in any way? Even Blinky hadn't been able to make this observation despite his sensitivity towards E-energy. This was the difference between a specialist and a generalist. Andraste and Yaika both began to frown. I don't know. I feel like the death energy is supposed to do something to the spear, but because it is already filled with destruction energy, nothing is happening. It is strange. That sounded interesting. What is supposed to happen normally, then? I cannot say for sure, but when I studied other weapons, Yaika was able to notice a small difference between them. Weapons such as Ketty's Bloodsinger have spilled the blood of hundreds, if not thousands of humans and aliens. All of that killing has colored that weapon with their deaths. I can't really describe it better than that. The more the weapon is killed, the more it becomes affected by the power of death. I don't know if it makes any difference. I don't believe Ketty's has noticed that her weapon has become deadlier because of that. It is probably nothing important. VS hadn't noticed this effect, and the same applied to others. If a weapon truly became more lethal after reaping a lot of lives, then such an effect should have been measurable. Since VS had never encountered any reports that described such a phenomenon, then at least two possibilities existed. Either the effect made no functional difference, or the weapons had not accrued enough kills to produce a significant outcome. VS was not quite sure what was true. He felt tempted to research this phenomena further. Though he and Blinky were not able to detect and accurately judge this supposed air of death, it might be a good idea to bring Andraste along with his examinations of other weapons. He was just about to reunite with all of the ace pilots of the Larkinson clan. After months of hard fighting on their own, the Dark Zephyr Mark III, the Amaranto Mark III and so on had fought dozens of battles. The Red War was so intense that the ace pilots truly were not lacking any fights. During each engagement, the Larkinson ace pilots and ace mechs must have confronted numerous alien phase lords and wiped out thousands of alien lives. All of that killing definitely caused their weapons to accumulate a greater amount of death. Perhaps this phenomenon could be tied to another related phenomenon, one that became increasingly more common among the front lines. On occasion, Mass killings and slaughter produced dark and ominous specters of death that mirrored their living counterparts. However, their behavior and attitude was a lot more reminiscent of demons. They showed universal hostility towards the living and sought to drag the latter to their deaths no matter the species. VS turned his attention to the subject that truly mattered. As much as he wanted to investigate this thread further, this was not the right occasion. As his daughter already described, the overpowering association with destruction prevented the Tier 3 destroyer spear from getting affected by the air of death. Perhaps VS might be able to change this somehow, but why would he go through so much trouble? Trying to blend destruction energy with death energy might result in a fantastic synergy, but the more likely solution was that both would fight even harder against each other. There was no way the two would be able to get along due to their characteristics. Just because they had a few things in common did not mean they were bosom buddies. If he wanted to violate common sense and make them work together in a harmonious fashion, then he would have to put a lot of effort into developing a convoluted mechanism. VS did not think that such an effort was worthwhile this time. "You should go back, Andraste," he said as he finally put his daughter down. The girl stood on the deck with a slightly stubborn expression. "No, I want to stay. Rosa's weapon might not be a sword, but it is still cool. I want to stay." "Fine, but don't do anything stupid." His daughter nodded before she and her companion's spirit began to frolic around while throwing frequent gazes at the weapon in the distance. The Tier 3 destroyer spear showed no signs of getting affected by all of the attention it was attracting. VS wondered whether that was an illusion. He couldn't help but ask whether destroyer weapons were actually alive. While the evidence he had gathered so far pointed out that the answer was a resounding no, he continued to doubt this conclusion. There was no rational argument behind his reluctance. He just felt that there was more to the story of destroyer technology than what he learned so far. The Terrans were definitely hiding a lot of details about their signature technology. The question was whether any of it was related to any hidden life. Damn it! Why is it so difficult to get real answers? He knew that there was no point in asking the Terrans directly. They were highly protective towards their effective monopoly on destroyer weapons. No matter which galaxy they resided in, they unanimously chose to keep the secrets of this high technology to themselves. VS did not blame them for their selfishness. As a mech designer who hoarded his own trade secrets, he knew the importance of protecting one's trump cards. Yet that did not diminish his frustration towards the Terrans. They gave away just enough destroyer weapons and information to tease interested parties, but never enough to satisfy them completely. This forced VS and others to rely on their own imperfect means to generate their own answers. For now, he only gained a possible lead on trying to form a connection between destroyer weapons and the amount of lives they reaped. Though he did not have a positive sentiment towards this research direction, it at least showed that there were more destroyer weapons than was apparent on the surface. Since a kid like Andraste was able to make a new observation on the destroyer weapon, VS thought about inviting others to make their own observations. What would they notice? What secrets might they uncover? What truths had he overlooked? The more VS thought about it, the greater his expectations towards this approach. Instead of inviting other people, VS chose to engage his design spirits. The fact that a companion spirit like Yika was able to detect an unusual phenomenon hinted that other spiritual entities may be able to detect other hidden facets about the Tier 3 destroyer spear. He first thought about bringing over the superior mother, but quickly reconsidered. She could probably tell him more than anyone else, but she was also the least likely to volunteer any useful information. Let's see. Who else can I invite? Perhaps it was better to start with another version of himself. VS was at least able to guarantee his own incarnation's cooperation. Blinky emerged from his head but quickly started to transform into a stocky and bearded dwarf. "Hello again, Vulcan. What can you see?" Chapter 74:14 The Edge of Oblivion. Chapter 74:14 The Edge of Oblivion. Letting other design spirits take a look at the Tier 3 destroyer spear was an inspired idea. Just like Yika, each spirit possessed a distinctly different way of observing reality. They could all look at the same object but interpret it completely differently. As the supposed god of dwarves, mechs, and craftsmanship, Vulcan's perspective was a lot more grounded in the material. He paid particular attention to the craftsmanship of the destroyer weapon. He was easily able to deduce dozens of characteristic design choices. His eye for the art and craft of weaponsmithing easily allowed him to deduce clues that VS had overlooked. Aside from that, he also possessed another advantage. As the patron god of many craftsmen, he had access to a lot of knowledge. While much of it was redundant, he still knew much more than VS could ever fit in his head. This is a weapon designed and developed by a team of Terran mech designers and engineers under the leadership of Master Smith Hernan Diorio. Vulcan drew on his vast reserves of knowledge and trivia to inform his other self. It is also the outcome of an experiment. VS reacted with surprise after hearing that. He did not get the impression that the weapon was experimental in nature. Its design and composition seemed pretty boring and standardized from his perspective. Experimental in what way? It may not look adventurous from your perspective, but not everyone has the habit of pursuing an extreme every time you innovate. The experiment is modest. Master Smith Diorio attempted to develop a Tier 3 destroyer weapon that possessed the penetration power of an armament that was one tier higher. To do so, he designed the spear tip so that the front of this component was made with materials that belonged to that tier. VS immediately frowned when he heard that. What Vulcan just said was not as simple as it sounded. Destroyer particles were extremely dangerous and volatile. Trying to control them was a nightmare, especially when they were compressed into very high concentrations. Any changes or deviations in the environment could easily cause catastrophic problems. According to the data, the sharpness and lethality of this weapon is not comparable to true Tier 2 destroyer weapons. VS said as he called up his own knowledge. While St. Rosa Orphan does not have the resonance strength to properly control a higher tier destroyer weapon, I suppose we never could have gotten our hands on this weapon if the experiment succeeded. The dwarven spirit gruffly nodded. The Master Smith took a slight risk only to end with a disappointing outcome. If successful, the Tier 3 destroyer spear should have become much more scalable to their wielders. A senior ace pilot did not have to upgrade to a better weapon because the destroyer weapon should have been able to accommodate his superior resonance strength. Unfortunately, the experimental weapon did not possess the capacity to concentrate more destroyer particles at the front of the spear tip. The distribution of particles has remained stubbornly even. It was like trying to separate hot air from cold air in a completely simple room by hand. It was practically impossible for any simple human to accomplish such a feat. VS could see what Hernan Diorio was going for. The modifications may not be large in scale, but a successful implementation would have been a game-changer in this field. Spears were particularly well-suited for this experimental approach. The Master Smith simply made use of a similar principle applied to regular spears with transphasic heads and applied it to a destroyer weapon. However, the Master Smith tried to be a lot more frugal and only changed the material composition of the edge and part of the structure underneath. This was such a small proportion that the success rate must have been abysmally low. However, Master Smith Diorio's caution and risk mitigation paid off. Even if his experiment failed, the outcome could still be salvaged. Vulcan confirmed that with his next words. While the Master Smith felt disappointed by the result, he was still able to recoup most of his costs by selling the failed experiment at a slight discount. Terrans heavily covet high-tier destroyer weapons no matter their shape or properties. The destroyer spear still reached Tier 3 standards according to standardized testing, so it is still a usable product. The main disadvantage of owning it and wielding it is its greater volatility. Due to the special nature of its edge, the weapon has become more unstable and is more prone to leaking destructive energies. This is why its subsequent owners have never valued it too highly. I see. I suppose it was too good to be true to win a proper high-tier destroyer at a grand auction. VS felt slightly disappointed after finding out that the precious destroyer weapon in his possession turned out to be a mildly defective product. Perhaps its lethality, toughness, and many other parameters matched that of other Tier 3 destroyer weapons, but its greater instability made it harder and more cumbersome to control. VS had always assumed that the weapon's frequent outbursts and tendencies to harm its own wielder was typical to its product classification. But the truth was that proper Tier 3 destroyer weapons were considerably less dangerous to their owners. Fortunately, the difference was not exaggerated enough to turn the failed experiment into an outright suicide weapon. So far, Saint Orphan and the Riot Mark III had made adequate use of it. The former's willpower was barely sufficient to suppress most backlash reactions, while the latter possessed so much superdimensional resilience that it could tolerate a lot of exposure to destructive energies. In fact, before the Riot Mark III went on a rampage with the powerful weapon, the Dark Zephyr Mark III also wielded it with good effect. VS had never heard any complaints from St. Tusa Billingsley Larkinson about the risks and temperament of the Tier 3 destroyer spear. This indicated that the failed nature of this powerful armament was not as dramatic as it sounded. It simply failed to achieve its slightly ambitious target. That was all. The side effects were not trivial, but not too concerning either. At most, St. Tusa and St. Orphan had to divert more willpower to keep their weapon in line than usual. The perfectionist Terrans who were used to wielding more controllable weapons might not be able to tolerate this flaw, but it didn't matter too much to the Larkinsons. Of course, part of the reason why that was the case was that the ace pilots in question never wielded anything superior. Their ignorance saved them from experiencing the same kind of disappointment as the Terrans. VS inwardly shook his head. He tried to focus on what was important to his current goals. What name did Master Smith Hernan Diorio have in mind for this creation if his experiment succeeded? The Edge of Oblivion. Vulcan readily supplied the answer. That would have been its name if the Master Smith did not spontaneously derive another name at a later date. This has never come to pass. Diorio held himself to such rigid standards that even minor flaws disqualified his creations from receiving proper names. In his particular weaponsmithing tradition, defective products did not deserve to represent his craftsmanship to the public. They were not only denied names but also lacked signatures, maker's marks, and even brands. It was already considered fortunate that they still got sold. VS could understand this mindset when it came to mass production. Products needed to be consistent and surpass minimum standards in order to reliably meet the expectations of many customers. Letting any defective product get sold not only betrayed the trust of a single buyer, but also affected the reputation of the entire line, especially if such incidents became more frequent. However, VS personally had a different mindset when it came to custom or artisanal products. To him, mild flaws did not necessarily disqualify a product from getting sold and used. So long as the buyer was properly informed about them, then it was up to him to decide whether to make use of it anyway. That was why VS felt a little let down by the Terrans. They scammed him during the grand auction by withholding important information about the Tier 3 destroyer spear. Of course, caveat emptor also applied. VS did not know nearly enough about Terran destroyer weapons to exercise proper judgment in that case. Not that VS would have passed the weapon over if he had any other choice. A defective high-tier destroyer weapon was still a powerful armament in its own right. VS personally felt that the Terran Master Smith behaved too much like Gloriana in this case. To deny such a magnificent if unstable destroyer weapon a proper name and attribution was far too exaggerated. He turned towards the weapon floating within a protective cage of azure energy shields and grew a little more emotional. Your maker may have denied you, but I am different from him. I am not Hernan Diorio. I do not hate your imperfections. Every little mark and flaw makes you unique. You are different from other Tier 3 destroyer spears. In my care, you will only become more distinctive over time. If you will allow me to override your old maker's work, I will promise that it will be worth it. Saint Orphan can bring you unimaginable heights so long as you cooperate. You are a Larkinson as long as you remain in our possession. So take heart and look forward to the future. Vulcan's expression grew a little emotional after witnessing his principal's behavior. I approve of your sentiment. Though the destroyer spear is not truly alive and intelligent enough to comprehend or acknowledge your meaning, your attitude is much better than that of the Terran Master Smith. Hold on to that as you work on the weapon. If it ever gains life, it will remember what you have done before. VS grinned. That is exactly one of the things that I have in mind. Sooner or later, I will upgrade it into a superdimensional destroyer weapon. That will also be the instance where I will attempt to bestow life onto it. My goal is to turn it into a proper high-grade artifact that has surpassed the limitations of its physical form. It may take a few years before I can apply this upgrade, but this will definitely be a big moment for our clan. He did not aim for anything too ambitious, such as bestowing it with the same kind of liveness as the Flower Parasol Mark II. He would already be happy if it gained just enough intelligence and awareness to match an ordinary second-order or third-order living mech. Vulcan looked thoughtful. Will you restore it to the point where it can wear its intended name with pride? VS shook his head. I think not. I admit that the Edge of Oblivion sounds cool, but if the metamorphosis is so great that my ownership surpasses that of its original maker, then I think I deserve to put my own stamp on the weapon. In any case, it is not as if Hernan Diorio has retained the right to object. From the moment he treated it as his abandoned child, he has no qualifications to make any further decisions. It didn't matter anyway. He checked the name on the galactic net and found out that the Master Smith remained behind in the old galaxy. Diorio had long moved on and created numerous other destroyer weapons since that time. Given that he was such a perfectionist that he disowned his defective products, his actual productivity must have been much higher. He was clearly a craftsman used to failure. There was no way to convince such an old and established Master Smith into changing his attitude towards his less-than-perfect children. What a pity. Learning about the history and original intentions of the supposed Edge of Oblivion had certainly been helpful to VS. He developed a slightly greater intimacy for the Tier 3 destroyer spear. Hello everyone, this is Shadow. Due to copyright restrictions on YouTube, I can't publish many of the audiobooks you love. That's why I've created a special paid service where you can enjoy over 300 high-quality audiobooks from platforms like Webnovel, Pocket FM, Audible, Wuxia, and more. Each novel comes as a one-time purchase, no subscriptions, no hidden fees. After payment, you'll receive full access via Telegram, along with all future updates for that novel. You'll find a wide selection of your favorite genres and titles, always in premium audio quality. Check the full list of available novels in the description. DM me now to get your favorite stories in audiobook form and start listening today.